Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
It's just Tuesday? We packed it a lot yesterday. I thought maybe you just have to check sometimes before you sign the check. I'm Joe Mathieu in the nation's capital. Good to see you. Tuesday, yes, edition of Balance of Power, the fastest show in politics here on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite radio, and on YouTube. Find us now on YouTube by searching Bloomberg Business News Live. We'll be off to the races again for another couple of hours here with news, well, kind of, on this funding deadline that's approaching. So here we are, 10 days out, right? The government runs out of money on the 20th of December. I've been talking about this every day for weeks. Nothing's changed, really, in terms of a deal to avoid this. Yet no one's talking about a shutdown. We're just going to drag this thing, I guess, right to the last minute. But we do have a sense of what the next Congress is going to be doing when it comes to the sequence of dealing with the border, dealing with the Trump-era tax cuts. And that's where we start our conversation today with Mike Dorning, Bloomberg Deputy Congressional Editor. Has been covering this for some time. Mike, it's good to see you. Welcome back.
Great to be here.
As always. So I want to pick through a couple of these. Let's just start with the funding deadline. CR till mid-March is what everyone's talking about. Why don't we just get to it?
Well, there's a couple of things that are outstanding, but most importantly is the size of the disaster aid.
Okay.
And here you have several problems cross-cutting, and it makes it hard to work out something within the House Republicans.
This is emergency funding to respond to the two big hurricanes.
Yes, and also some of it
Southeast.
going back to the Maui disaster.
That's right.
On the one hand, you don't really want to risk that people aren't going to have the money to keep working on the disaster aid in North Carolina and South Carolina and Hawaii and California. Lots of other places there have been disasters. On the other hand, you have, number one, a conservative group within the House Republicans that always wants to pay for this by cutting other things, that says, hey, you know, we always have disasters, so you should be cutting something else, not just adding to the pot. And then you also have people fighting over how much money there should be in disaster aid. So that's the main thing that's the sticking point. The tension over how much money to give to disasters aid and whether you should pay for it or not. They're not going to pay for it in the end. That's just like something you have to get past.
Where that goes.
But the size of it will be the main holdup. You can also use that as a carrot later on by not funding it enough, so that when you need to get the next thing through, the North Carolina, South Carolina, California, Hawaii people are all like, I got to vote for this because I can't cut off my constituents.
So you have done this before.
Yes.
NDAA, I'll ask you about funding the government in the new year and so forth. And by the way, are we going with March? Is that the CR? We'll fund this till March, kick the can.
We'll see. It'll be somewhere soon.
The annual defense authorization. We hear every year it's must pass. Looks like this will pass. We got top lines over the weekend. But really interesting, that there's a 14% pay raise for junior enlisted troops. Nobody can vote against that, right?
Yeah, the problem is it's getting caught up in other things. You would think that it would get through, but they've got, on the one hand, they want to do some things that with transgender troops that make progressives unhappy. There's some things that some of the conservatives feel like they want more things. They want like restrictions on abortion and travel for abortion and things like that. So you can lose those things. My guess is one way or another, whether you do the NDAA or you do some other stripped down thing, those troops will get that raise reasonably soon, because like everyone believes the junior enlisted troops need a raise. I mean, some of them are on food stamps. It's like these are people who are defending the country.
Sure.
Maybe they should make a decent living.
Well, that's quite a sweetener there if you're on the fence about all of this. To the transition, then, the two words that seemed to change the world for Pete Hegseth were good conversations. Joni Ernst, with a fairly benign statement, but many folks thought she might sink his nomination. Her concerns over sexual assault in the military, her experience as a woman serving in combat. But boy, things have changed a lot this week. Everybody woke up on Monday following the Ernst statement and knowing there'd be a meeting and hearing Donald Trump on Meet the Press. Said, wait a minute, maybe this guy actually makes the grade.
And she kind of revived that nomination a little yesterday.
Yeah.
He was definitely gasping for breath there. Two things happened over the weekend, or late last week and over the weekend. Number one, she had kind of been completely non-committal, given him a very polite, cold shoulder, and clearly was hoping that it would just die and Trump would withdraw it. But Trump moved in, supported him some, and then conservatives came in hard on her and said, you don't do more to support him. We'll challenge you in your primary in 2 years. Now, she hasn't said she'll support him, but she said some kind words, positive vibes. And in Washington, that can be crucial because he just needs to make it to the next week. And without some sort of kind vibes, it was looking like he might not. And you live to fight another day, you could win.
Huge pressure campaign for Joni Ernst in this case. So you start to pull out the lens a little bit. Tulsi Gabbard being pretty well received yesterday on Capitol Hill, starting to answer questions about Syria and so forth, reminding people she has a top secret security clearance and was promoted.
Top secret is not that high a security clearance, just so you know.
But had that since her visit to Syria in 2017. I don't have one of those. And then there's RFK Jr., who's going to be holding meetings next week, we're reading now on the Hill. Will start his meetings. Is there a world in which all three of these controversial nominees, initially seen as controversial, are in fact confirmed?
Yeah, there's definitely a world where all three are confirmed. It's quite possible. I still think Hegseth is probably in the most danger of those three because the disagreements with Tulsi Gabbard and RFK Jr. are kind of policy oriented. They may be very basic policy.
Understood.
She was seemed to be supportive of the Assad regime and Russia.
Not the personal challenges we're dealing with.
But like Hegseth, the personal challenges are of easy to understand for everyday Americans and salacious, allegations of rape, drunkenness, financial mismanagement. That's something that tends to be more of a wildfire in the press and people talk about it. You might agree or disagree with RFK Jr.'s sort of unorthodox views about vaccines or Tulsi's views about intervention abroad and foreign governments, but they're not like the thing that excites people as much.
Well, it's really interesting. At the same time, maybe ask this slightly differently. Let's say they all get to their confirmation hearings. What kind of a show are Democrats going to put on here, even if they are confirmed? These could be some very difficult and personal questions posed to Pete Hegseth. Could be for RFK Jr. as well. His history with drugs, his past comments, allegations again of sexual advances that might not play too well publicly. What are Democrats prepared to do in terms of making a stink about any of these people?
I would imagine they are going to make a huge stink about all three of these people. And the important thing is each of these people are now being introduced to the American people. These impressions, our parents told us, first impressions matter. Look someone in the eye, shake them in the hand, shake their hand. These will set the public impressions of these high-profile people. And in those confirmation hearings, I would be very surprised if you don't see Democrats pushing the allegations against Pete Hegseth, the sexual misconduct ones. I would be very surprised if you don't see a strong effort to characterize Tulsi Gabbard as, a potential national security risk, and RFK Jr., his unorthodox views about health and vaccines, and frame them for the American people. Whether they get approved or not, a different question, and Democrats essentially can be outvoted. The question is, some of them, there might be some Republicans who also don't want to go along with them.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, it'll all be aired out in public, even if they do make the grade. Some damage could be done here.
It's not just the confirmation hearings;
right.
It's all the debate going
That's
up
right.
until
Absolutely.
then.
We have weeks until we're at the point of getting a vote. Mike, thank you so much. Mike Dorning covering the transition for us and the funding deadline in Washington. We're 10 days out. We'll get this figured out at some point, and of course, you'll hear about it right here on Balance of Power.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
I'm Kailey Leinz alongside Joe Mathieu in Washington. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, where we're continuing to keep track of the Trump transition and his nominees who have been frequenting Washington and more specifically Capitol Hill in recent days as they try to make their cases for Senate confirmation. This includes some of the more controversial picks that are out there, including Tulsi Gabbard for Director of National Intelligence, Pete Hegseth for Secretary of Defense. And next week, as Joe mentioned just moments ago, RFK Jr., the nominee to lead the Health and Human Services Department, will be making his rounds as well. All of them trying to make the case, Joe, to get to the requisite number of votes required to actually take these cabinet level positions. And it does seem that the calculation around the difficulty some of these may actually have in getting to confirmation has shifted within the last week for Pete Hegseth especially.
Yeah. Well, that's right. And he has Joni Ernst to thank largely for that. Good conversations, I believe. The statement suggesting that they had another meeting, it went well, and she would like to help him get to the hearing. The question was, would he even get that far to take questions from senators publicly here? Hegseth meeting today with Senators John Cornyn, Cindy Hyde-Smith, and Steve Daines. We're also following, as you mentioned, Tulsi Gabbard with more meetings today as well. Yesterday was day one. She's just getting rolling. Hegseth's been up there for some time now. Tom Cotton and Jim Risch, the two Republican senators, meeting today with Tulsi Gabbard, incoming Senate Intelligence Chair, and then, of course, Foreign Relations. That's where we want to start our conversation with Megan Scully, who drives our congressional coverage here as our editor in Washington, D.C. Megan, let's start with Pete Hegseth, because Kailey points out wisely that it's just the vibes have shifted quite a bit over the past couple of days. People were on watch for him to withdraw a la Matt Gaetz until Joni Ernst put out her statement, allowed for another meeting. Will he get to a hearing?
So let's just step back for a second and explain why Joni Ernst is so pivotal here. And that is because she is a combat veteran. She sits on the Armed Services Committee, and she's a survivor of sexual assault. Right. So, and the allegations which Hegseth has denied of sexual assault have been looming over this whole confirmation process. So she has been considered the key vote here, the linchpin. There are several others who, such as Senator Collins, Senator Murkowski, who could still vote against him. Should note that Ernst has not said she'd support him, that she would just support him through the process, get him to that confirmation hearing. So more work needs to be done. But certainly it seems more likely after her statement last night than at any other point of this confirmation process.
Well, so then the question becomes to what extent we can attribute her tone here or her lack of willingness to this point to give a firm yes or firm no to the pressure she is getting from the MAGA base of the Republican Party and the threats to potentially primary her in her next election fight.
Absolutely. A lot of this is about self-preservation. She could face a primary from the right if she does not support Hegseth, and so she's feeling that pressure at home. It is certainly, putting some of her legacy is indeed on the issue of military sexual assault, and sort of putting that at odds with her own, instincts to survive in her next reelection campaign.
Interesting to hear, not only to your point from Joni Ernst, but we're watching Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski asked about why they were even having meetings with Pete Hegseth to begin with. Collins said, how else am I going to get a sense of him and ask questions? Murkowski said, don't you want to know who your accusers are? What do you make of these replies and the pressure campaign that they might be feeling?
So this is bringing back a lot of memories for, I think, many of us to the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation process, where Susan Collins and Murkowski were, sort of the key votes, and Collins ended up voting after a speech on the floor, voting to support his nomination, and of course he ultimately got confirmed, despite the allegations of sexual assault, which he also denied. So. But it is very standard. I think it would be malpractice for them not to sit down and talk to him. Yeah. He is a nominee, and I think that meetings are par for the course here. This is, they can ask him pressing questions, and go back and forth in terms of his priorities. Should he be at the head of the Defense Department? Susan Collins will be the chairperson of the Appropriations Committee, and half of all federal discretionary spending is defense spending. So that is certainly something else she needs to talk to him about. Yep.
I want to talk about Tulsi Gabbard as well, because the spotlight on her nomination has perhaps intensified given the events of the last several days and the downfall of the now ostracized Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad, who, of course, she met with in Damascus years ago. Is that net helpful for her confirmation prospects? Because the question was about her relationship with Assad, who is no longer leading Syria, and therefore isn't necessarily as much of a live question for an incoming administration as he would have been before.
I think that is still very much to be determined as we sort out what is next in Syria. But the bigger question and concerns about Gabbard really have to do less with Assad and more about her freelancing on a matter of very sensitive national security and foreign policy when she was a sitting member of the House, and she went and met with Assad in Syria. So there will be, I assume, still questions about what she would do as the director of national intelligence when it comes to some of these other regimes in the world.
Well, so we move on, if I can throw another log on the fire, to RFK Jr., who will reportedly be on the Hill next week. Bloomberg reporting that he's got a meeting with Senator Tommy Tuberville. What are these hearings, assuming they get to hearings, going to be like for Democrats? Are they coming in off the top rope here hot with tough questions, and the easels are going to be set up in the hearing rooms, or is it happening now in advance of the hearings?
So right now we're seeing most of the nominees just meeting with Republicans. They know that most of these nominations are only going to get passed on a party line vote, at least the controversial ones, and that's if they're lucky, if they can get that party line vote. Going into the hearings, Democrats are certainly, this will be their moment to grill these nominees. And to go back to the Kavanaugh confirmation once again, we saw Democrats who were in the minority really grilling. There were famous moments of Kamala Harris and Amy Klobuchar, all people who went on to run for the presidency, really, hitting the spotlight and making national news. And we will certainly see that, particularly with the most controversial of these nominees.
So we have a lot to look forward to come January, obviously. But this Congress, before the next one can hold these hearings and do all of their business in 2025, they still have business to figure out this year, including 10 days from now, a funding deadline.
Yes.
To continue the government funding and to not shut it down. With just 10 days out, we still have no clarity on what kind of continuing resolution or other solution will be put forward. How much longer is this going to take?
Although, you're a veteran of these negotiations. You know that nothing actually comes together until the last few hours before a shutdown. I feel like there is very little appetite for any kind of disruption in government spending, particularly as the Congress is coming to a close and as is the Biden administration. We're going to see most of that funding kicked to the spring, and where a Republican Congress and a Republican administration can, hash out the details. Where we might see some movement, or we expect to see some movement in the coming weeks, is on the issue of emergency aid. And we could see a package coming together pretty quickly on that.
And it probably will be close or not close to the $100 billion requested by the White House.
I think that there is talk even among Republicans of getting close to that, but just a few votes could swing anything either way. So
we know that to be true. All right, Bloomberg's Megan Scully, who leads our Capital Influence team here in Washington. Thank you for joining us here on Balance of Power, and we of course have much more coming up on the program, as well as we consider not just what's happening in the transition, but the incredible circumstances this transition is happening in. As there's been really incredible developments in geopolitics with what has happened in Syria, still an issue for the Biden administration to deal with, but one that the Trump administration will inherit.
Yep, that's for sure. We'll have more on that coming up later, and certainly the timing with Tulsi Gabbard arriving in the Senate is quite remarkable. They wouldn't believe this stuff if you wrote it that way. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz. We'll have a lot more ahead right here on Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
There is a very pronounced conversation underway right now with a lame duck session in Congress, the wind down of the Biden administration, and the uptake here of the transition to the next Trump administration about what to do with Syria following this incredibly fast-moving series of events over the weekend. Kailey, we saw Damascus fall, Bashar al-Assad move to Moscow, and everyone is moving to their own benefit here, including Israel, into that buffer zone along the Syrian border, and deploying troops beyond that buffer zone for the first time since 1974, with a lot of questions about their motivations as well.
Well, and the Israeli Defense Force is saying today that they have been targeting strategic weapon stockpiles in Syria, and in fact, according to the IDF, within the last 48 hours, have struck most of those stockpiles. We're talking here about things like sea-to-sea missiles, anti-aircraft batteries, and the like. The intention here, of course, to make sure that while there is this power vacuum in Syria right now, a lack of clarity about what exactly happens now that Assad is gone, a dictator deposed, the rebels that overtook him and ultimately pushed him out of the country are a designated terrorist organization by the U.S. HTS is not clear yet when you talk to experts on the Middle East, as we have done over the last several days, as to whether or not they are an entity that can be entrusted entirely at this time.
Yeah, this is something that we wanted to talk to Nick Wadhams about, who runs our national security coverage out of Washington, D.C., and has been rather busy the last couple of days. Nick, it's great to see you. When will we have answers to these questions? Because we're looking at, obviously, a power vacuum.
Right.
We have seen one of these individuals reach to become a formal prime minister. How long will that hold? What's happening?
Well, I mean, this is the question that the U.S. is really grappling with, and obviously Israel as well. I mean, the challenge here is everybody was very happy to see Bashar al-Assad go, but really there are just so many questions about HTS. As you mentioned, a designated terrorist group. So far, the administration line is they're saying the right things. They're saying they want to empower Syrians, maybe potentially do some sort of transitional government. But, you know, there are so many different factions who seem to have control of various parts of Syria, and some of them are, I mean, the Islamic State. I mean, these are the guys that the U.S. spent untold hundreds of millions of dollars to eradicate a few years ago, and they are in some ways on the rise again. So there's a real question. I think that's why you see some of these moves by Israel hitting these military targets. They do not want this material to fall into the wrong hands. So, I mean, a ton of unknowns right now.
Well, and it's not just Israel. We should point out the U.S. has targeted dozens of ISIS sites specifically in parts of Syria. And yet at the same time, we're hearing from both the Biden administration and we've heard from Donald Trump that they are still trying to keep a distance to a certain degree here with what's going to happen next. If there is that concern about a potential resurgence of ISIS, why won't the U.S. get more intimately involved in this?
I mean, so this is what they have said for a long time. This is not our fight. We do not want to get involved. And then they
But it could become our fight, right?
It has been our fight. I mean, Donald Trump, people forget this. Donald Trump, in his first administration, his first overseas sort of formal military action was strikes against Syria in 2017. This was during his summit with Xi Jinping in Mar-a-Lago, where he slipped out and ordered these Tomahawk missile strikes on Syria. Then he did so again after after the Assad regime used chemical weapons against its own people. So you have this pattern where the administration says they don't want to have anything to do with Syria, and then they have a lot to do with Syria. Obviously, the Islamic State. And as you mentioned, I mean, they pronounced the Islamic State eradicated. But clearly it keeps sort of cropping back up, and they have to do these strikes. The big question is going to be what happens if the Islamic State affiliates itself in some way with HTS, and you start to see not just a situation where the Islamic State is sort of poking its head above the parapet, as it were, but in a situation where they are actually helping run the government. Then does the U.S. want to go to war with the self-proclaimed new government of Syria? That is something they really do not want to have to answer.
Considering the small number of American troops in Syria at the moment, to what extent can the U.S. or should the U.S. leverage allied Kurdish forces still in the country?
Well, the Kurdish forces question is also hugely complicated because Turkey, another country that is trying to seize some sort of advantage here amid the chaos in Syria, sees the Kurdish fighters as a sworn enemy. This has been a huge point of tension with the United States. And obviously, when you have a situation where there are so many other priorities for the U.S., where they want Turkey's help on squeezing Iran, on squeezing Russia, NATO membership, who knows what's going to happen with Ukraine. I mean, there's just so many. How big of a priority are these Kurdish fighters going to be for this administration, given Turkey feels so strongly about it? So it's a real question of also prioritization, which incidentally is what you saw with Russia, why they are not supporting Syria. Their priorities were Ukraine, and now we have exactly the situation we've seen unfolding.
Well, and now Russia has potentially lost a critical port in the Mediterranean as a result. On Iran, though, which you just mentioned, obviously Syria and Lebanon border each other. Iran has used Syria as a conduit to get weapons to Hezbollah, which already has been seriously diminished by the Israeli offensive over the last several months. Now that potential line of replenishment has been broken. So what does that do to not just Iran's ability to operate with its most powerful proxy, but also do for Israel as it still has conflict ongoing with these proxies?
Right. Well, I mean, they are now in a putative ceasefire with Hezbollah, so they've sort of declared, at least for the time being, a cessation of hostilities. I mean, look, in some ways, Israel is going to proclaim this as a major victory. They went after Hezbollah, they put the squeeze on Iran, and you have essentially seen Iran and Hezbollah retreating from Syria, and that's created this situation we have now. So, you know, it's an extraordinary moment. I mean, the chess pieces are just moving all over, and who has control and who doesn't are just very, very difficult to figure out. But, you know, what we are starting to see, which is worrisome, is after the initial almost jubilation about the fact that Assad has left, it's like, okay, well, who comes now? And this is going to be very, very complicated. Israel, as you mentioned, I mean, yes, you can say, okay, they are defending themselves outside of this buffer zone, but a lot of people will see this as a land grab and, you know, changing the facts on the ground. Right. As they jockey for position.
Well, interesting comments from Benjamin Netanyahu yesterday, effectively taking credit for what happened. Right. In his remarks to the nation, he said his country had reshaped the Middle East as we promised we would do. We've heard so much about the errors made by Russia and Iran leading to this. To what extent is he correct?
Well, I mean, certainly going after Hezbollah and essentially decimating them, putting that pressure on Iran. I mean, you know, the U.S., there was a call a senior administration official did with reporters over the weekend as this happened. There was a little bit of credit taking there as well by the U.S. Listen, we created the conditions for a very brittle regime with sanctions both on Iran and Syria. So a lot of folks taking credit. Will be very interesting to see how many are taking credit 6 months from now if they don't like this new government that takes control in Syria and what the situation is on the ground there and whether it's a force for stability or further instability in the region. Yeah,
well put. Almost like he's seen this before. Nick Wadhams, great to see you. Thanks for the insights and the reporting. Our national security team is doing great work. Kailey on the terminal and online on this story. If you're looking for the latest in the Middle East, look no further. We've got a big day tomorrow, CPI Day.
Yeah.
Next stop on the road here when it comes to kind of gauging the next move by the Fed, but also getting the political backdrop to this incoming administration.
Yeah, although I think for our audience here on Bloomberg TV and radio, the Fed's going to be the most important question that is addressed first next Wednesday, of course, the decision. And it's a kind of live one. It's not clear if we're going to get another 25 basis point cut. And tomorrow's data could help the market decide one way or another what it thinks is going to happen.
For sure. Michael McKee is watching this for us, of course, and always a pleasure to spend a couple of minutes with our economics editor at Bloomberg TV and radio. Michael, what are you looking for tomorrow at 8:30?
Well, we're actually looking for something we haven't seen in a while, which is a bit of a rise in inflation. CPI on a month-over-month basis, the headline expected to go up 1/10 percentage point faster than it has over the last 4 months, 0.3 gain, but that would push the year-over-year number up to 2.7% from 2.6. And while it may be energy related, while it may be housing related and things the Fed can't affect, just the fact that it goes up is not going to make people happy.
Well, so if it goes up slightly, why would rates go down slightly, Mike? What's the justification?
Well, the betting at the Fed is this is just temporary. It's kind of a one-off thing. And if you deconstruct what we see in the CPI, almost all of the rise that we're getting these days is in housing. And the Fed's been waiting for that to drop. And there isn't much they can do. They can lower interest rates to try to bring down housing costs. But there's just not enough housing supply available to make a major difference. So they're kind of looking through that right now. The other question is what's happened to food? We know that with the October hurricanes, there may have been some problems with fruits and vegetables and things like that. So there may be things that the Fed can't do a lot about, and they think the economy is in good enough shape that they can lower rates and that they should because they don't want to see unemployment start to rise.
Joe Biden speaking a little bit earlier at Brookings about his own economic record and a bit of a warning of what might come with the next administration. Let's listen to what he said.
He seems determined to impose steep universal tariffs on all imported goods brought to this country on the mistaken belief that foreign countries will bear the cost of those tariffs rather than the American consumer. Who do you think pays for this? I believe this approach is a major mistake.
We know, Michael McKee, how he feels, I think, about Donald Trump's economic plans. How will his own economic record be remembered here in the early stages as we look back on the term of Joe Biden?
Well, I suspect it's going to be remembered reasonably well when you look at the overall macroeconomic statistics. And unemployment was really low. Inflation went up because of the pandemic and has come down significantly and still could before he leaves office even farther. And growth has been very strong, stronger than anticipated each quarter this year. So overall, in that sense, his record is good. The issue is going to be how historians square that with the fact that Americans felt things were not good and voted basically the Democrats out of office.
Yeah, and not just at the executive branch level with his successor. Mike, just quickly on what he was speaking about, this notion that tariffs are a bad idea. A lot of economists obviously do think that will be inflationary. How quickly could that translate into an end of the cutting cycle for the Federal Reserve potentially?
It would probably take a little while, Kailey. Now, Trump comes into office with some already with some executive orders, some authorizations from the USTR to impose some tariffs. So he could start right away, but then we have supply chains that are still fairly long. It takes a while for the prices to get through. We do pay them in one way or another, or companies in the U.S. will pay them, but it probably wouldn't show up in inflation until later next year or in 2026. So the president can do it for a while, and you know that people are going to be watching closely, though, for any sign of price increases.
Well, we know Michael McKee will, as always, who, of course, covers international economics and policy for us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Mike, thank you very much. We'll be looking for Mike's analysis when that CPI data drops.
Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.